This happened to me in the fall of 2023, when I took a babysitting job in a suburb outside Boulder, Colorado. At the time, I was 21, and in my last year of community college. I was doing a mix of classes and part-time work, and one of the ways I made extra money was by babysitting for families in a local Facebook group. Most of the jobs were easy. A couple hours on a Friday or Saturday night, maybe order the kid a pizza, make sure they brush their teeth, and sit on the couch until the parents got home. That's why I said yes to this one so quickly. The post was from a woman named Melissa. She said she needed a sitter for one night, from about 7 p.m. until a little after midnight. She had one son who was 8 years old, already very independent, and the pay was better than average. Her house was in a neighborhood called Pine Creek Estates. It was one of those newer developments where every house looked expensive, but also weirdly similar. Big windows, long driveways, 2-car garages, and not many trees because everything had been built too recently. When I pulled up, Melissa was already waiting on the porch. She was friendly, but in a distracted way, like her mind was on something else. The dad, whose name was Ryan, barely said anything at all. He was standing near the kitchen island checking his phone while Melissa showed me around. Their son Owen was in the living room building something with Legos. He seemed quiet, but not shy exactly. More like he was preoccupied. Melissa walked me through the usual stuff. Snacks were in the pantry. Owen's bedtime was 9:30. He could watch TV until then, and if there were any problems I could call or text. Then, right before they left, she added something strange. If Owen says someone is outside his window, just tell him it's the motion lights. I kind of smiled because I assumed that was just one of those weird kid fears parents get used to. But Owen looked up from the floor when she said it, and he didn't look embarrassed. He looked annoyed, like she had said something unfair about him. I said, "Does he get scared at night?" Melissa was already grabbing her purse. "Not scared," she said. "Just imaginative." Ryan finally looked up and said, "He knows the rules." Then they left. That wording stuck with me. Not because it was terrifying or anything. Just odd. "He knows the rules" sounded less like something you say about a child, and more like something you say about an employee. The first hour was normal. Owen barely talked. He watched some cartoon on Netflix while I sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. Around 8:15, I made him some boxed mac and cheese, and that was when he started opening up a little. He asked what kind of car I drove, whether I liked scary movies, and whether I'd ever been in a house where someone died. That last question came out of nowhere. I laughed because I thought he was joking and said, "Not that I know of." He nodded, like that confirmed something. Then he asked, "Do you lock your bedroom door at home?" I said no. He stirred his mac and cheese around for a second and said, "You should." I asked why. He shrugged and said, "Because if it opens on its own, then you know it's not you." That should have been the moment I texted Melissa and made up an excuse to leave. But kids say creepy random stuff all the time, especially if they have watched too much YouTube or overheard adults talking. I figured it was one of those situations. At around 9:15, I told Owen it was time to start getting ready for bed. He went upstairs without arguing, which honestly surprised me. I followed him to the second floor and saw that the layout was simple. A master bedroom on one end, Owen's room on the other, and a bathroom between them. When he reached his room, he stopped in the doorway and looked at me. "Can you close the blinds first?" The way he said it made me look over immediately. His room faced the backyard, which backed up to a narrow strip of undeveloped land with a walking path beyond it. The blinds were half open, and outside I could see the reflection of the room in the dark glass. Nothing else. I pulled them shut. He visibly relaxed. After that, bedtime went smoothly. Teeth brushed, pajamas on, 1 glass of water. He asked me to leave the hallway light on, which didn't seem unusual. Then, as I was about to leave the room, he said, "If you hear tapping, don't check the window." I turned around. What? He was already under the blankets. "If you hear tapping," he repeated, "don't look outside." I asked him where he heard that from. He said, "From him." I stood there for a second, waiting for him to explain. He didn't. I said good night and pulled the door mostly closed. At 9:47, I was back downstairs in the living room when I heard the first tap. Very faint. Glass. Not downstairs with me. Upstairs. I muted the TV. There it was again. Tap. Tap. A pause. Tap. I sat still for a second, already irritated at how quickly my skin went cold. It could have been a branch, except there weren't any trees close enough to hit the windows. It could have been Owen playing around, except the sound was definitely coming from outside the glass, not from inside the room. I grabbed my phone and went upstairs. The tapping had stopped by the time I reached the landing. I opened Owen's door a crack. He was sitting upright in bed staring at the window. The blinds were still shut. Without taking his eyes off them, he said, "I told you." My voice came out lower than I expected. "Owen, is someone out there?" He shook his head once. "Not anymore." I walked over and checked the window anyway, parting the blinds carefully with 2 fingers. The backyard was empty. Motion lights glowed over the patio, throwing long shadows over the grass and the low fence at the back. Beyond that was the dark strip of land leading to the path. No person, no animal, nothing. I closed the blinds again and told Owen it was probably just the house settling or something hitting the siding. He looked at me the way adults look at children when they know they're being lied to. Then he said, "Don't let him hear you say that." I left his room with every hair on my arm standing up. At 10:11, Melissa texted asking how things were going. I almost told her to come home. Instead I wrote, "Everything's okay. Owen's in bed." She reacted with a thumbs up. That was it. At around 10:30, I went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. That's when I noticed one of the motion lights in the backyard had come on again. It illuminated the far corner of the yard near the fence gate. No movement. Still, I found myself standing there longer than I should have, staring through the glass. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A reflection behind me. Not in the yard, in the kitchen window itself. Someone standing in the doorway between the kitchen and hall. I spun around. No one was there. I actually laughed once under my breath, but it was the kind of laugh you make when your body has already decided something is wrong. Then I heard footsteps overhead. Not a child's quick little steps, heavy ones, slow. Crossing from one side of the second floor to the other, I yelled, "Owen!" The steps stopped. I ran upstairs. His room was empty, blankets thrown back, window blinds still shut, hallway light glowing pale yellow over the carpet. I called his name again, louder this time. No answer. I checked the bathroom. Empty. Master bedroom. Empty. Then I heard a small voice from inside the closet in Owen's room. "Don't open it." I froze. "Why are you in there?" "Because he came in." That was enough for me. I yanked the closet door open. Owen was crouched inside between hanging jackets and a laundry basket, both hands over his ears. He started crying the second the door opened. I pulled him out and asked what he meant. Who came in? What happened? He kept shaking his head. Then, while I was kneeling in front of him, something moved in the hall behind me. I saw it first as a shadow crossing the strip of light under the bedroom door. Someone was standing outside, not moving, just standing there. I grabbed Owen's hand and backed into the room. Every part of me expected the doorknob to turn. Instead, there came 3 soft knocks, not hurried, not violent, just 3 polite, deliberate taps. Owen made this panicked little sound and buried his face in my side. Then a man's voice from the hallway said, very calmly, "You weren't supposed to open that one." I swear I stopped breathing. The voice didn't sound muffled or ghostly or anything theatrical like that. It sounded like a real person standing right outside the room. I snatched up my phone and called 911. While it rang, I shoved the dresser in front of the bedroom door as best I could with one hand. The dispatcher answered, and I started talking too fast, explaining that there was someone in the house, that I was with a child, that I needed police immediately. As I was saying all of this, the voice in the hallway spoke again, this time softer. "She can't see me either, can she?" The dispatcher heard that part. She immediately told me officers were already on the way. I asked Owen if there was another way out of the room. He pointed to the window. "Second floor." Not an option. For the next 3 or 4 minutes, which felt way longer, nothing happened. No more knocking, no footsteps, just silence. Then, from downstairs I heard the front door open. The dispatcher asked if police had arrived. I said I didn't know. Then I heard Melissa call up from below. "We're home!" I almost cried from relief. Then Owen whispered, "That's not her voice." It was close, incredibly close. But once he said it, I heard it too. The tone was wrong, a little too flat, a little too careful. The dispatcher told me not to move, not to open the door, and to wait for officers to announce themselves clearly. Then we heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, unhurried, coming up. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. The footsteps reached the landing and stopped outside the block door. A woman's voice said, "Open the door, honey. It's Mom." Owen was shaking so hard I could feel it through his whole arm. Then from outside, much farther away, we heard pounding at the front door and a man yelling, "Police department!" The woman's voice outside the bedroom door went completely silent. A second later, something moved fast down the hallway. Not footsteps this time, more like a rush of weight. Then nothing. When the real police got upstairs, the hall was empty. So was the rest of the house. But they found the back sliding door downstairs cracked open by about 2 inches. Their alarm sensor had been disabled with tape. Melissa and Ryan got home 20 minutes later for real. Both of them pale and angry and apologizing over each other. Apparently their security company had called them after the front door alarm failed to arm correctly, but by then I had already called 911. The police searched the yard, the path behind the house, and the open land beyond it. They found footprints near the back fence, size 13 work boots. No clear trail after that because the ground got too hard near the path. The part that stayed with me happened while one of the officers was taking my statement in the kitchen. Owen was sitting with his mom wrapped in a blanket, and I heard him ask her, in this tiny exhausted voice, "Did he use your voice again?" Melissa just closed her eyes. I found out later from a text Ryan sent me a week afterward that this wasn't the first time someone had been on their property. There had been small things before. Motion lights going off, a side gate left open, tapping at Owen's window. Once, a voice on the baby monitor back when he was younger. They never told me because, according to Ryan, they didn't want to make it into a thing. I never babysat for them again, and I never took another job where the parents left out rules that specific, because if a child tells you not to look at the window, there's a good chance they already know what happens when someone does. Story 2. I got stranded in Arizona and ended up in the wrong town. This happened to me in the summer of 2018 during a solo drive from California to Texas. I had just finished a seasonal job near San Diego and was heading back to Houston, where my brother and I were sharing an apartment at the time. I'd made the drive before, and it was usually long but manageable if you planned your gas stops and didn't do anything stupid. The problem was, this time I did do something stupid. I took a side road to save time. It was late afternoon when I crossed into Arizona. My GPS was working fine, but I noticed it kept rerouting me because of construction farther east. Eventually it suggested a smaller state road that cut across a wide, mostly empty section of desert and reconnected with the interstate later on. It was supposed to save me 40 minutes. So I took it. For the first hour, it seemed fine. Hardly any traffic, straight road, mountains way off in the distance, dry heat shimmering above the pavement. Then my cell signal dropped. That wasn't ideal, but it also wasn't surprising. About 20 minutes after that, I saw smoke coming from under the hood. I pulled over immediately. By the time I stopped, the temperature gauge was maxed out. I waited maybe 15 minutes before checking the engine, but I don't know enough about cars to do much beyond looking confused at hot metal. I had water, but not enough to start experimenting in the middle of the desert. A truck finally came by around sunset. The driver was an older guy in a tan work shirt who pulled over and asked if I needed help. He took one look under the hood and told me there was a good chance my radiator hose had blown. He asked where I was headed. I told him Houston. He actually laughed at that. Then he pointed down the road and said there was a town about 8 miles ahead with a gas station and a payphone. A real town? I asked. Real enough, he said. He offered me a ride, which normally I wouldn't have taken, but I didn't exactly have better options. I locked my car, grabbed my backpack, and climbed in. The town was called Mercer, or at least that was what the weathered sign said at the edge of it. It wasn't really a town in the normal sense, more like a few buildings clustered around a crossroad, an old gas station, a diner, a laundromat, a church, and maybe a dozen houses farther back from the road. What struck me immediately was how empty it felt. Not abandoned exactly. Just paused. The gas station was open, but nobody was pumping gas. The diner had lights on, but I couldn't see anyone inside. Even the houses looked strangely dark for that time of evening. The truck driver dropped me at the gas station and pointed across the road to a small motel. "Stay there tonight," he said. "Ask for June." Then he drove off before I could ask anything else. Inside the gas station, there was one teenage guy at the register and a cooler full of drinks humming loudly enough to fill the whole room. I asked if there was a tow company nearby. He said, "Not after dark." I asked if the motel had rooms. He said, "If June says so." Same wording as the truck driver. That should have made me leave right then. But leave for where? I didn't have signal. The sun was going down, and I was in the middle of nowhere. So I went to the motel. It was one of those old one-story roadside places with 6 rooms in a row and an office at the end. The vacancy sign was dark, but the office door was open. A woman in her 60s sat behind the desk reading a paperback. She looked up as I came in and said, "You're the one from the highway." Not asked, stated. I told her I needed a room for one night. She looked at me for a long second, then slid a key across the counter. "Room 4, she said. "Keep your curtains shut." I almost smiled because it sounded so melodramatic. Then I noticed she wasn't smiling. I asked if there was Wi-Fi. No. Cell service? No. Food nearby? The diner closes at 9. I picked up the key and asked how much I owed her. "Tomorrow," she said. The room itself was clean enough, just old. Floral bedspread, loud air conditioner, one lamp by the bed, one dead-looking painting of a desert landscape over the dresser. I dropped my backpack, splashed water on my face, and went to the diner. Inside were only 3 people: a waitress, an older man in a denim jacket, and a woman, maybe in her 30s, sitting alone in a booth by the window. All 3 of them looked up when I entered. The waitress gave me a menu and coffee. The older man kept glancing at me in a way that made me increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually he asked, "Car trouble?" I said yes. He nodded slowly and said, "You should be back in your room before 10. I asked why. He looked toward the woman by the window, who had not touched her food once the entire time I was there. Then he said, "Because people knock." I honestly thought he was messing with me, some desert town local joke. I paid, thanked the waitress, and headed back to the motel a little before 9:30. The parking lot was still empty except for one dusty pickup I assumed belonged to June. Inside my room, I tried using my phone one more time. No bars. I watched local TV for a while, then lay down still wearing jeans because I never feel fully comfortable sleeping in roadside motels. At 10:14 p.m., someone knocked. 3 knocks. Not loud, not aggressive. Just enough to be intentional. I sat up in bed and listened. Silence. Then 3 more knocks. I went to the window but remembered June telling me to keep the curtains shut. Instead, I crossed to the door and looked through the peephole. No one there. The parking lot was empty. I stayed there for a few seconds. Then the knock came again. This time from the window. 3 taps directly against the glass. I backed away so fast my heel clipped the bed frame. My first thought was branch, but there were no trees anywhere near the room. My second thought was prank, but I still hadn't seen a single kid, or really anyone under 40 since arriving in Mercer. Then a man's voice from outside the window said very softly, "Please, let me in." That was enough. I went straight to the phone on the nightstand to call the office. It wasn't connected, just a dead line. The tapping came again, now moving slowly along the wall toward the door. Tap, tap, tap. Then the doorknob turned. Not hard, just a testing motion. I shouted, "Go away." Everything stopped. For maybe a minute there was absolute silence. Then from outside, farther away, I heard another knock. Then another. Then another. Not on my room, on other doors, moving down the row. I don't know how to explain how unsettling that was. It wasn't like someone trying to break in. It felt more like someone checking. I stayed awake most of the night. At some point I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember is sunlight and someone pounding hard on my door. It was June. I opened it, and she looked immediately past me into the room before meeting my eyes. "Did you answer anything?" she asked. I said no. She relaxed in a way that really bothered me. Later that morning, a mechanic from the gas station drove me back to my car and patched the hose well enough for me to limp to the next actual town. While he worked, I asked him what the deal was with Mercer. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "People stop there when they break down." "Yeah," I said. I noticed. He kept tightening something under the hood. "Not everyone leaves." I laughed once because I didn't know what else to do. He didn't. Eventually he told me the story locals apparently all knew. Years earlier, before the interstate rerouted traffic away from Mercer, there had been a crash involving a van full of migrant workers. A few survived the wreck and made it to town at night asking for help. According to the story, nobody let them in because there had been a robbery in a nearby county, and the townspeople thought the strangers might be involved. By morning, several of them were dead from exposure and injuries. That part sounded exaggerated to me until he added this. "Every couple years someone hears knocking in Mercer. If they open the wrong door, they stay." I asked if he believed that. He looked at me and said, "I believe June keeps a spare key ready." I got back on the road that afternoon and made it to New Mexico before dark. My cell service came back about 20 miles later. A year after that trip, I looked Mercer up online out of curiosity. There was no Mercer, Arizona on the map. No motel, no diner, nothing. I thought maybe it had been absorbed into some unincorporated area or renamed. Then I found an old forum thread from somebody who collected ghost town histories. One post mentioned a highway stop called Mercer that had been mostly abandoned by the late 1980s after the interstate bypassed it. Apparently, the motel burned down in 1994. What gets me is not the idea that I stayed in some haunted place. I don't even know if I believe that. What gets me is this. I still have the motel key. Plain brass key tag. Stamped with one number. Story 3. My roommate started talking to someone who wasn't there. This happened to me in 2016 during my sophomore year at a college outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was living in a residence hall called Morgan House, which was one of the older dorms on campus. It wasn't creepy in the abandoned asylum kind of way. Just old. Radiators that clanged at night, windows that didn't seal properly in winter, and long, narrow hallways that always smelled faintly like dust and laundry detergent. I had a random roommate that year named Caleb. At first, he seemed normal enough. Quiet, but in a standard college guy way. He played a lot of video games, skipped morning classes more than he should have, and talked on the phone with his girlfriend every night around the same time. For the first 2 months, we got along fine. Then, right after Thanksgiving break, something changed. The first sign was how little he slept. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and see the glow of his desk lamp still on. He'd just be sitting there, not gaming, not studying, just staring at the wall by the window. The first time I asked if he was okay, he said, "Yeah, just listening." I asked what he meant. He said, "The girl in the vent talks after midnight." I laughed because I thought it was a joke. He didn't. A couple days later, I came back from class and found our room freezing. The window was open even though it was early December in Pennsylvania and snowing lightly outside. Caleb was standing beside the radiator with his hand over the metal vent, like he was trying to feel air movement. I asked why the window was open. He said, "She doesn't like when the room gets too warm." That was the first time I genuinely thought he might be having some kind of breakdown. I told our RA, a senior named Mike, that Caleb had been acting strange. Mike said final season made people weird and promised he'd check in. Nothing changed. If anything, Caleb got worse. He stopped going to class entirely. He started writing things on sticky notes and arranging them along the edge of his desk. Not sentences, just words. Listen, quiet under again. Blue door, I remember that last one because there was no blue door anywhere in our dorm. One night around 1 a.m., I woke up because Caleb was whispering. Not on the phone. Facing the wall vent by his bed. I couldn't make out most of what he was saying, but I clearly heard. I didn't tell him. Then a pause. Then, no, he won't open it. I sat up and said his name. He turned toward me so fast it actually startled me. His face looked exhausted, but also irritated, like I had interrupted something important. Did you say something? I asked. He stared at me for a second and said, You should stop asking when she's here. I slept in the lounge that night. The next morning, I told Mike again, more seriously this time. He finally came to our room and had a conversation with Caleb while I stood in the hall pretending not to listen. Caleb sounded completely normal. That was the creepy part. He joked with Mike, said he'd just been stressed, said he was behind on sleep, and apologized if he'd been weird. After Mike left, Caleb closed the door and looked at me. Then he said, very calmly, Now she knows you told. I actually laughed from nerves and said, Okay, man. He didn't respond. That weekend, most people on our floor went home or stayed with friends because it was the gap before finals really started. I stayed on campus because I had a paper due Monday and needed the library. Saturday night, Morgan House felt almost empty. By around 11 p.m., I realized I hadn't seen Caleb in hours. His coat was gone, but his wallet and phone were still on his desk. I texted him anyway. No response. At midnight, I went downstairs to get something from the vending machine in the basement, and that's when I noticed a door I had somehow never paid attention to before. It was at the far end of the basement corridor past the laundry room. Painted blue. I actually stopped walking. The hallway down there wasn't one people used unless they were doing laundry, and the lighting was terrible, so maybe that's why I never registered it before. But the second I saw it, one of those sticky notes flashed into my head. Blue door, I told myself it was meaningless coincidence. Then I saw something taped to the door. A sticky note. I walked toward it before I'd fully decided to. In Caleb's handwriting, it said, Don't let her hear you knock. At that point, I should have gone straight to campus security. Instead, I tried the handle. Locked. I went back upstairs and called Caleb again. Still no answer. I ended up knocking on Mike's door, but he wasn't in his room. Nobody else on the floor seemed to know where he was either. So I called campus security. The officer who responded was a middle-aged guy who clearly expected to find a drunk student messing around, not whatever I was trying and failing to explain. Still, he followed me to the basement. The blue door was still there. The note was gone. That made me feel insane immediately. I told him I knew it had been there. He gave me the kind of nod adults give when they're humoring someone without saying so. Then he unlocked the door. Behind it was a narrow stairwell leading down another half level to what looked like an old storage area. The air that came up smelled stale and damp, like closed pipes and old concrete. The officer went first. I don't know why I followed him, but I did. At the bottom was a small room full of maintenance junk, broken chairs, mop buckets, old bulletin boards, boxes of fluorescent bulbs, and Caleb. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the far corner facing the wall. The officer said his name twice before he reacted. When Caleb finally turned around, his expression was completely blank. Not scared, not relieved, not embarrassed, just blank. The officer asked what he was doing down there. Caleb said, "Waiting for her to finish." The officer looked at me, then back at Caleb, then told him to stand up. As Caleb got to his feet, I noticed something written on the wall in black marker just above where he'd been sitting. It wasn't large. Just one sentence. "He keeps waking up." The officer must have seen it too because his whole tone changed. He told Caleb to come upstairs immediately. Back in the hallway, Caleb became agitated for the first time. Not violent, just panicked. He kept saying, "You opened it too early," over and over. Campus security took him to the student health center, and from there, I think he ended up being transferred somewhere for psychiatric evaluation. I never saw him in the dorm again. That should have been the end of it. But two things happened after. The first was that 3 days later, maintenance workers found another message on the wall inside the blue door room, written over the first one. This time it said, "Now he's heard her too." Nobody admitted writing it. The second was what my RA Mike told me near the end of the semester after a couple beers off campus. He said Morgan House used to be a girls' dorm decades earlier, and there had been an incident involving a student who died in the building after getting trapped in a basement storage area during winter break. He didn't know all the details, only that campus tours never mentioned it, and older staff avoided talking about the lower level service rooms. I asked if one of those rooms had a blue door back then. Mike got quiet and said, "How do you know that?" I moved out of Morgan House after that year. I still know people who lived there later, and none of them ever mentioned anything unusual. Maybe Caleb really was just having a mental health crisis, and my sleep-deprived brain turned a bunch of unrelated things into a horror story. I've told myself that more than once. But here's the part I can't explain. When I was packing to leave in May, I found one last sticky note wedged behind my desk. Not on Caleb's side of the room, mine. It had only 2 words on it. "You listened." And even now, if I hear someone whispering through a vent after midnight, I leave the room.